The Washington football team, formerly the Washington Redskins, finally has a new name, and it's the Washington Commanders. It took them 2 years to come up with Commanders. And first of all, I don't think they ever should have changed the name Redskins. I don't think Redskins is a derogatory term. I don't think it's the equivalent of the N-word. It never was. I think a bunch of white liberals kind of feigned this outrage over Redskins, and the team stood up to all the nonsense for years and years and years. But then a couple of years ago, following the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter, they finally caved into the pressure for political correctness and had to virtue signal by getting rid of the name Redskins, which, as far as I'm concerned, was a compliment to Native Americans. I think that when the franchise came up with that name, it was out of respect. They were glorifying Native Americans. They admired them. It was a way of honoring them. Why? Because they had qualities that they wanted to emulate on the field. They were courageous warriors. They were hardworking. They were perseverant. That's why you name a football team after something, because you want to be associated with the good characteristics, the good traits that whatever you're naming your team after has. Think about the names of football teams. A lot of teams are named after animals: lions, bears, eagles. These are strong, majestic animals that people admire. Look at the Super Bowl. It's the Bengals versus the Rams, right? It's not the skunks versus the turkeys. I mean, who's going to name their team that? So if you're an animal and a team is named after you, it's because you're an animal that people are attributing positive characteristics to. Some of the teams are named after people: the Raiders, the Buccaneers, the Patriots, or the Cowboys. These all have positive connotations, right? You don't see football teams named the Wimps or the Pansies or the Sissies. So naming your football team the Redskins was a compliment. It wasn't an insult. This whole thing was about political correctness. But what also really bothers me is this new name, the Commanders. And when I read some of the stories as to why they were coming up with the name Commanders, not that it's like a really bad name in and of itself, but it's the reason that they came up with it. They said that they wanted the team to have a name that represented the capital, because this is Washington. It's the nation's capital. And so they took that very seriously because they represented our capital. And so they wanted the football team's name to be associated with the qualities and the stature of the nation's capital. And so they came up with Commanders. And unfortunately, they're right, because we actually have a command economy, a socialist economy being commanded from Washington, D.C. Now, that's not the way it's supposed to be. But unfortunately, I guess the owners of the Washington football team recognized that the economy is being commanded from the capital. A more realistic name for the team would be the Washington Bureaucrats, because that's really what they are, is a bunch of bureaucrats. But that's not the type of name that you want to have for your football organization. You know, a better name, I think, than the Bureaucrats, because if you want to stay with the theme of red, how about Bloodsuckers? Because that's really what they are. Blood is red. So how about the Washington Bloodsuckers? Of course, they're not going to come up with that name. You know, there's a lot of other fitting names that they're probably not going to use either. Like, how about the Washington Tyrants? That seems kind of appropriate. Or the Washington Lobbyists. I think that would be a good name for the team. Or maybe the Washington Pork Barrels. But, you know, if you think about it, the best name potentially that preserves the red aspect of the original team with something that's very befitting of Washington, D.C. would be the Washington Red Tapes. But what might be a little bit more fitting, because it kind of sounds like Commander, and it's also associated with the color red, would be Comrades, because the Russians were red. And so how about the Washington Comrades? Because basically in Washington, D.C., you really have a bunch of communists. So the Washington Comrades. In fact, why not shorten it to Commies? After all, Commies is far more appropriate for Washington, D.C. than Commanders.